Okay, so today we have Sage Davis, who is one of my colleagues at Holistic Child and Family presenting for us. Sage, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to get to share my presentation with you all. So I'll just share my screen and we'll get started. So like Ellie said, my name is Sage Davis. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the MSW interns here at Holistic. I'm really excited to talk about religious trauma and autism with you all. This is a special interest for me and something that I have lived experience with. So very grateful for the opportunity to just info dump. And before I get started, just wanted to invite everyone to take care of yourselves during the presentation as needed. Anytime we're talking about trauma, it can be activating, so please just do what you need to do. So to get started, I wanted to give a little background on autism and religion. So in the past, researchers thought that autistic people couldn't be religious because of the lack of theory of mind, but there was no empirical evidence for this. Surprise, surprise. And autistic people have their own unique way of relating to, understanding, and participating in religion, where some people may find it deeply comforting to have the rituals and traditions, where others might find that they have limited interest or that they struggle with religious concepts, just like any other person. Likely unsurprisingly, autistic folks do tend to interpret religious texts more literally, which can lead to some of those unique perspectives, as well as having a bottom-up processing style, which focuses on details and forms conclusions from the bottom up, rather than assuming or having an instinct for the big picture and making details fall into place. Of course, religious settings can involve unspoken social norms, which can be challenging, but they can also provide a sense of belonging and understanding and support. And this acceptance can be really meaningful, especially for folks who feel marginalized in other social contexts. And religion can serve as a really great coping mechanism, can provide comfort and have a structured framework that helps navigate life's difficulties. However, several studies have found that autistic traits might negatively impact traditional religious experiences. Autistic children and adults in the research showed a more negative view of God, especially in regards to ruling and punishing, as well as greater fear of God and less positive feelings, which, when we're thinking about interpreting religious texts literally and focusing on details, that makes sense. So, in thinking about what an autistic person's relationship with religion might look like, somebody might be more of a systems thinking skeptic, which is a name that I can't take credit for. I have to give the credit to Christine Greenwald, who's a therapist, who used that phrase in her article, and I thought it was just perfect. Um, so, this type of person is willing to confront questions even when the answers might not be what they want, because integrity and belief is important. So they're not someone who believes things just because they feel good. They believe them because they're sensible or they're correct. And it might be the literal thinking, but when people say that they believe something, they assume that person really believes it. And if they act in ways opposed to their beliefs, they're not just going to let it slide. So if they see a belief system that doesn't add up, it's going to bother them. So this person might be less motivated by the comfort and relationships that come with religion, and more by having that logical framework. So they'll be more quickly able to spot logical inconsistencies and might be faced with questions that they can't avoid, even if they're not trying to answer them. So for folks who are really committed to religion, this might be a painful and reluctant process that they can't necessarily disengage from, where for others, they might have seen logical fallacies early on or never really understood the emotionality behind religion. And so it's easier for them to ask and answer these questions. An autistic person might also be an all-in believer. If the autistic brain is trying to make sense of a world that feels overwhelming and confusing, religion offers a way of explaining pretty much everything. The rules provide structure and predictability and a way of making sense of things. And having all these rules might elicit a fawn response from folks who want to stay in the good graces of adults or the trusted people in religions. This might be especially true for higher masking folks who learned what to do to blend in socially at the cost of having high anxiety and an uncertain sense of self. So This person might have figured out the rules of the social game called church and finally found a way to be socially comfortable. In religion, it's normal or respected to be, quote unquote, on fire for God. People aren't going to look at you oddly for having really intense interest. And so it can be a way for folks to use a special interest to navigate social situations. While that there's still a set predictable structure of routine going on with church and a sense of security and eternal destiny, which is really comforting. So the all-in believer might be somebody who keeps religion for a long time. They really want to make it work because they found a way to share special interests with other people who generally accept them as they are. And they have teachings that are providing comfort and security and a way to live a moral life, which is something that many autistic folks take really seriously. So when we're thinking about high control religions specifically, these are religions that tend to draw people in who are isolated and seeking a sense of purpose. They have repetitive rituals, seemingly close-knit social bonds, and rules about good and bad that can appeal to folks looking for connection and structure. As the book Unmasking Autism explains, autistic adults are at elevated vulnerability for financial exploitation, domestic violence, relational abuse, and emotional manipulation. Autistic adults tend to be in socioeconomically precarious positions, which can make it harder for us to lead people who mistreat us or make us more willing to be dependent on religious groups quickly as a matter of necessity. ABA therapy and social masking also instruct us to be compliant and conformist. And so our yearning to be accepted and tendency to downplay our feelings can also leave us prone to mistreatment. And orthodoxy and rules about how we're supposed to act can feel really grounding and rational. High control religions promise a life filled with meaning and a new family who will never leave you, when in reality, they can bring people into a web of incompatible expectations with rejection looming forever. And since these organizations rely on their members' devotion, free labor, and donations in order to function, they have a vested interest in making sure people feel like their efforts are never enough. And so these warning signs of a high control group, which also are from Unmasking Autism, highlight how high control religions can create environments that potentially increase the risk for trauma among their members. And so you see it includes things like the group having an antagonistic view of the outside world or non-group members, so this us versus the world mindset, group members constantly feeling insecure in their position of the group, or that they may be punished for any mistake or failure, repetitive language or jargon being used to dismiss criticism or empty cliches to silence difficult conversations, personal boundaries being discouraged. People are expected to view the group as a family and sacrifice as much as they can for it. And any perspective that challenges the group's orthodoxy is unspeakable. So members are feeling shame for thinking or feeling the wrong things. And so those warning signs of a high control group or a high control religion can lead to adverse religious experiences, which, as it sounds, is any experience in religion that undermines someone's sense of safety or autonomy and negatively impacts physical, social, and emotional well-being. And so these are the experiences that have the potential to result in religious trauma. And the questions on this slide come from a questionnaire that was actually made by a church to help folks reflect on if they may have had adverse religious experiences. And so you can see that it includes more overt things like being shamed or humiliated, being discriminated against, as well as more covert things like having to compromise your moral self or thinking that God doesn't love you or accept you. And there are no parameters for what does or doesn't constitute an adverse religious experience, but it can be useful to think about them in three big categories of abuse, neglect, and communal practices. So when we're thinking about communal practices that can be adverse experiences, we're really thinking about the ways that religion exerts power and control over people. And so there's this religious power and control wheel that might look familiar if you've used the power and control wheel or quality wheels that are used for interpersonal relationships. Similarly, this one shows different ways that religions can be set up to exert power and control through rules, requirements, punishments, and consequences. And I'm going to briefly touch on all of the categories on the wheel, but before I do, I just want to acknowledge that this and a lot of the resources on religious trauma right now are very Christian centered, even when they're meant to be representing religion more broadly. So this is by no means a definitive list of what power and control might look like. But first, we have loss of autonomy, where intuition or personal thought and opinion are rejected, and the group expects that you believe, think, and act like everyone else. Isolation, so having to cut off relationships for people outside the group, or having increased levels of commitment being required so that they're really taking all of your time. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, so this might include calling something a sin versus naming things as abuse, or having someone being required to forgive or take ownership for how someone else's actions harmed them. Emotional abuse, name calling, coercion, and manipulation. Spiritual abuse, being required to just submit to a higher authority because God or the Holy Scripture says so, and being threatened with consequences for sin or breaking group rules. Threats, accusations, and intimidation, being told that if you leave the church or the religious group, that the devil will get you, that you won't be protected, or not being allowed to seek outside help through like medical help or therapy. Emotional control, or sorry, economic control, requiring a portion of your paycheck, unpaid volunteer hours, this idea that you have to trust God for your needs and you can't take personal action or accept charity. And then sexuality and gender defining, so having rigid gender roles, conversion therapy, and requirements of purity. And the idea of sexuality and gender defining is worth looking at in a little bit more detail, especially when we're thinking about how religious trauma might impact autistic folks. In the US context, there's a lot of discussion around purity culture, especially in fundamentalist Christian religions, which is like a mirror of rape culture. Purity culture includes the restriction of all sexual activity to heterosexual marriage, with defined roles for the husband and wife, where the wife is taking care of the kids, and the husband is the head of the family and providing financially. And there's a huge emphasis on modesty and sexual purity, especially for AFAB folks, and of course, abstinence only sex education. So we know that there's a higher correlation of gender and sexual diversity among autistic people. And we know that autistic folks are more likely to take roles deeply to heart. And so many folks who grew up in purity culture may have done so without even a diagnosis to make sense of their experiences. And I think that this quote from an article by a queer autistic reverend does a really incredible job of illustrating the harm of purity culture. She said, "Nowhere in this story was there space for queerness or disability. The story worked against my physical needs for pain management and symptom support as a person with a disability. And the story held no possibility of individuation. Individuality barely gets a mention as a decoration on the temple. Instead, it was a message of suppression." So if all of that stuff that I just talked about are adverse religious experiences, I still have to define what religious trauma itself is. And religious trauma refers to the lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being after an adverse religious experience has occurred. And so the impact of religious trauma can vary from person to person, but might include cognitive impacts like confusion, dissociation, difficulty with decision making and critical thinking, identity confusion, negative beliefs about self ability and self worth, black and white thinking, and perfectionism. Emotionally, there might be increased anxiety, panic attacks, depression, suicidal ideation, anger, grief, loneliness, powerlessness, and lack of meaning. And socially, a person might voluntarily or involuntarily lose their social network or family, especially if their social network or family are also part of this high control religion, as well as potentially losing their employment, all of which, of course, can lead to financial stress. And culturally, if someone is deconstructing or choosing to leave a high control religion, they might be unfamiliar with the secular world, leading to these fish out of water feelings and difficulty belonging, especially if there are big information gaps, like not being taught about evolution or not being able to, listen to modern music, TV, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to end with resources that I found really useful for learning more about this and for supporting clients. And so the first is the Religious Trauma Institute, which provides psychoeducation for survivors as well as clinical resources for professionals. And they have a research group if you're interested in research, as well as the Reclamation Collective, who also hold support groups for survivors, and they have specific support groups for queer and BIPOC survivors, as well as workshops for professionals and a therapist directory if folks are trying to find therapists who specifically work with religious trauma. The Adverse Religious Experiences Questionnaire, which again is not like a clinical thing, but just meant to help folks reflect on if they have potentially experienced religious trauma. Thinking about purity culture specifically, Erica Smith is a really great resource for sexual education that is specialized in supporting folks after high control religion. And so you can find webinars as well as support groups and individual coaching. And then finally, this organization Recovering from Religion, who offer a peer support line that folks can call or chat with, as well as a therapist directory and informational resources for folks who are thinking about deconstructing or leaving religion. They have things explaining different religions, as well as like, how do I set up a bank account for the first time? How do I kind of start filling in these informational gaps that might exist? And so these were the resources that I thought were really comprehensive and can be useful in figuring out how to best support clients who may have experienced religious trauma. And then, of course, I have my resources and references here. If you have any interest in learning more about this, I really recommend that article by the Queer Autistic Reverend, as well as having other information on autism and religion specifically. And I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have if you put them in the chat, or just hear what folks have to say about this topic.
Sage, I just want to say how helpful this is, because this is you and I have talked about this a bit, and like this is kind of one of my specializations as well, and I just feel like there's so much here around this that's giving me more of a framework, and I really, really appreciate it, and I'm excited to go and dive into some of the resources and look more closely at your slides. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. It's really hard to find like frameworks like you're saying for this. So glad to be able to like help create more resources for that kind of thing.
I just wanted to comment the that overlap between high control religion and neurodiversity for the life skills thing, right? That's so I feel like it compounds because, right, if you've got executive function issues, right, or social communication differences, and you've been kept away from like both education as well as peers, right? I feel like that gap in just like the on-ramp is so hard, right? Into just like from that high control environment into like the world, right? Which you've been taught is evil, right? And so you're scared and there's a gap in like skills, and it's like that on-ramp is so big, right? It's awful. I was homeschooled, right? I was homeschooled and I'm neurodiverse, and there's shit. It's awful, right? And so I think that experience of feeling very different and very alien, right, is like such a disservice.
I could not agree more.
There's a really great question from Gabriella in the chat. What would you recommend for a client that is quite religious but is being negatively impacted, but that's the only community where they feel accepted? Which is like something I think a lot of us have probably seen.
Yeah, that is a really great question. And if other folks have ideas as well, Ellie, Steph, or Marie, happy to have y'all jump in too, because that's really hard when that's the only community somebody has. You don't want to take that community away from them. But obviously there are quite a few negative impacts that can come from these high control religions.
I like to think about, you had the power and control wheel in there, like doing some of the kind of discussion around the power and control wheel, kind of similar to how you might work with someone who is in a relationship where there are power and control dynamics that it might be beneficial for them to explore, and like also maybe looking at like what other avenues might they have for um, connection. And Samantha asked, are they open to connecting to other communities? Oh, so Gabriella says they don't have that client anymore. But yeah, I think that that is a big question. And then Robin says the connection between compliance-based modalities and risk for high control religions is interesting. Important to explore what feels safe and why. Yeah, for sure.
Going to this question, so sorry, Marie, and I use any and all pronouns. I think that I use just sort of like a lot of psychoeducation, not just in sort of community building and not demonizing one community or one support by adding other supports, but also doing a lot of psychoeducation related to sort of expectations, especially when taking everything very literally, that maybe the sort of views that are within their organization, some of them might be like highly controlled, and then others might be sort of implied, but they're taking it as incredibly literal. So I talk a lot about what messages are meant for us. So I give examples of like I will have an emotional response to reading data on a page. So if I'm watching a 24-hour news channel where somebody is shouting at me this information, I'm going to be overwhelmed and start crying. So when an organization, any organization, is trying to encourage people to have certain behavioral changes, the way that they communicate that is usually not for the neurodivergent. The neurodivergent person is generally much more sensitive to that, takes that much more seriously. I just think about like when I was little and I would cry in the back of the classroom when the class got scolded. I never did anything wrong. And the only feedback that my teacher gave to my parents was that I needed to toughen up. But in an environment that's not only like your current, happiness and cohesion, but also your eternal life, though that messaging can be taken in a way that sometimes is just not really intended. And so exploring some of the nuance is a way that I've encountered that and sort of like created some space and allowed them to have more logical thinking. And most of the time when I've done that, they've once they sort of had a little bit of an in, they started questioning everything and deconstructing and creating something that was like really beneficial for them. And I also just want to say thank you so much, Sage, for this. I know I was asking a lot of questions when I was in graduate school about sort of like cults versus religion and highly controlled. I have family that was in highly controlled religion and also in the Heaven's Gate cult. And all the instructors said, like, we're not going to get into that because when you start exploring that, then like it's a slippery slope to start talking about all religion. And in our collective zeitgeist or culture in the US, it's a really touchy topic. And it's hard to get good information. It's hard to just have good consultation around. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the space, because like you're saying, it is a really difficult topic to talk about. And going through the research on this, I was pretty stunned at how little folks even dig into this at all, because of how touchy it is. So really appreciate the community giving space to just talk about it.
I'm curious about, this is a little bit of an aside, but this topic's making me think about this. Oh, sorry, Bobby Joe, she, her, I forgot to introduce myself. It's making me think about just if anybody's aware of resources in general that are really, really neutral around just deconstructing religion. I had a client a while back who this had came up, and they were at a place where they just not necessarily clear religious trauma, but just like questioning the religion they were raised in and trying to figure out where they're falling with that. And I think as an autistic person, it's helpful to have, I mean, it's so complicated, right? Because like religion is so complex, right? But having some like resources of like a guide or some steps of how to even start to think through that. I'm just wondering, when I did some research and looked, all I could find was either so polarized stuff. It was either things coming from religious, religious organizations that are basically, subtly trying to keep you looped in, or it is coming from people who have left, and are kind of like religion is awful, which I don't think either of those are helpful for those people who haven't yet had enough space to decide how they're feeling. And so I'm just curious if anybody is aware of just like good, truly neutral kinds of resources, like a list of prompts and things for folks to just start to do some of that questioning process or deconstructing and their religion overall.
I would love to hear if other folks have ideas. I will say the Recovering from Religion, they have resources that just go over like what do different religions believe, and it's just straight up supposed to be like factual, like so I do think that there is some useful resources on the Recovering from Religion website that do just go into like what does it look like to question a religion? What are some like critical thinking questions I might want to be using? So I think that that one can be helpful, but would love to hear if other folks have resources.
I don't have specific ones to point you to, but I think a good place to start are Unitarian and Quaker resources, because those are religions that do active questioning and do a lot of embracing the questions and non-dogmatic religious thinking. So if somebody is wanting to still be part of a religious community or think about it in a way that is more open on the religious side, but isn't going to push a dogma, I think those are great places.
This is Katie McCrae. I was actually going to put that in the chat. I wasn't sure if it was relevant, but I am a Quaker and I've been for about 30 years. I'm also ADHD. And I've started to consult to Quaker meetings within New England. I'm in Connecticut. So the Quaker meetings on the coasts are much more liberal and like Robin described, like very open-ended, non-traditional, non-dogmatic. There are other branches of Quakers that are not like that. However, I find it a very autistic religion or autistic-friendly religion for a lot of the reasons that you pointed out. But again, it's that is a religion, so it's not kind of like the question that you ask, which is super neutral. So
yeah, and that's I think that's kind of what I'm looking for. And I will say, and I guess if there's other folks who are interested, I will admit that like I'm not working with this client anymore and other things happen, but this conversation is bringing me back. This is one of those things. So when I tried that, I did start to create something of kind of what I wanted, because that's always my way. If I can't find it, I guess somebody needs to create it. But I will also say, like, this is not an area that I feel like I have the most experience. Like, I have a general sense of here are some good things to ask yourself to help you get to how do I feel about this. So I did attempt to start. I would have to go back and find it and see what level that's in. But if there's anybody who has interest in that would like to work on something like that collaboratively, I'd be really open to trying to create something. And again, I also was just collecting some of these resources. So if I do come back to that, I've got some other places to look at and other things, because I will admit it is now since there's not the immediacy of working with that client, or it's not right here, it is now in the ADHD pile of unfinished great ideas right now for me.
Couple of other resources folks are mentioning in the chat. Samantha mentions Brian McLaren, Faith After Doubt. Gabriella says, totally not neutral, but I remember an account, Aaron Rackham on TikTok, who talks about religious trauma and has a playlist and speaks from personal experience and is a therapist. And then Emily also shares an interest in collaborating on the project Bobby Joe was talking about. And Samantha also added the book I recommended above. So that's the Faith After Doubt, talks about stages of faith in general, not necessarily 100% unbiased, but Samantha shares that they used it for their dissertation compared to other theories and thought it was the most useful, and also open to connecting, as it's a passion of Samantha's as well.
Sage, thank you so much. This was just incredible, and the resources that you've put together are so helpful. And you're right, there's just not a lot out there, and I really appreciate your sharing with us.